Joining me live now is Dr. Zuhdi Jasser, founder of the American Islamic Forum for Democracy. Thank you very much for joining us. Doctor, now let's start with the breaking news that's just come in. Hamas releasing 2 US hostages, quote, for humanitarian reasons and to prove to the American people and the world that the claims made by President Joe Biden and his fascist administration are false and baseless. What do you make of those comments?
Well, I mean, first of all, we're blessed and glad that the 2 were released. And however, we can't forget that there are over 100 more, if not, we don't know the exact number of hostages. So at the end of the day, we realize that obviously this is a war. They release them because they know that there's an invasion pending in order to respond to the terror war that Hamas began against Israel. And ultimately, they're trying to limit that response, if you will. And President Biden's speech, while some of the verbiage was good, I can tell you as an American and somebody who's been fighting against the anti-Semitism, the radicalism within the Islamic faith community, the Islamist movement, if you will, this is not how you respond. It's not, there's no moral equivalency. They are a vicious, a genocidal regime that needs to be defeated and decimated, and ultimately, hopefully, the hostages that remain will be saved, and they will not be victims. But Hamas can no longer exist. It needs to be destroyed, like every enemy in the past that has destroyed the enemies of freedom. It's a war of civilization against uncivilized, and the Palestinians, unfortunately, are cannon fodder for Hamas. And Hamas is trying to somewhat balance that, if you will, as much as terrorists could. They're trying to balance that because they realize their own people are beginning to rebel against them. And I'm sure wherever they're holding these hostages, the places they're holding them also want to release them because they don't want to be victims of Hamas.
You mentioned the Palestinians being cannon fodder. We just heard Antonio Guterres there, the UN Security Council, talking about the lifeline, the trucks, the 20 a day that are meant to be going in, but we're also hearing that they need around 100. There has been talk on the Palestinian side that they need that humanitarian aid desperately.
Yeah, the aid absolutely is something that they need, but again, right now, there was a declaration of war and acts that killed up to 1,500 Israelis in an offensive act. So, yes, the humanitarian aid is going to be present for any of the innocent civilians that are collateral damage. But make no mistake, the Israeli Defense Forces responding is a very different, it's similar to, I was in the Navy 11 years. We have a moral fighting force, no different than the Israeli Defense Forces are a moral fighting force. And when you are attacked, you have to respond. The Palestinian community is victims of the regime that they control. I called for an Arab Spring that should have happened after 2011 in the Palestinian areas of Gaza and the West Bank against their radical leaders, and that never happened. Many of us were saying that, maybe it's time for the Palestinians to have their own Arab awakening, like the Syrians, like the Libyans, like the Tunisians did. And unfortunately, it didn't happen, and now they're going to have to be awakened to the fact that the force that attacked Israel for no reason whatsoever is going to have to respond, and to say somehow they don't have any moral agency, that somehow the terror acts of Hamas are the equivalent of a moral response by the Israeli Defense Forces is just complete nonsense. There has to be a response by Israel in order to protect its state from future invasion, and every free country in the West would respond similarly if our neighbor attacked us the way Hamas did.
We understand it's the biggest attack on Israel since the 1973 Arab-Israel War. However, the UN's reporting 50,000 pregnant women, for example, in Gaza can't access food and health services. They're facing unbearable circumstances, including the lack of food, water, safe delivery and services. What would you say to that?
Well, listen, first of all, a lot of the lack of services is not new. the UN's information, by the way. We saw, for example, the hospital that was supposedly bombed ended up being a misfired rocket from the Islamic Jihad. So the UN's information sources appear to be first Al Jazeera and other Islamist type media arms rather than the reality. And unfortunately, we see even members of Congress like Rashida Tlaib saying things just 2 days ago after it was proven that it wasn't true. So the bottom line is that we have to, yes, the plight of the Palestinians is important, but we have to separate what has been their plight for years because of Hamas's control of entry and exit and continuing the people in a way that is saying that they want to destroy Israel rather than actually come to peace and recognize them. This whole war happened because the Saudis, because many of the Arab countries were beginning to normalize relations with Israel. So Iran fueled it in order to blow up the area and not caring about humanitarian issues. So right now, yes, we'll try to minimize and bring in support as needed. But President Biden's speech yesterday about just sending money in, that's not the solution. There's a lot more that has to happen, and that needs to include military support with our SEALs, our special forces, and others to help not only bring back the hostages, the Israeli citizens that were innocently abducted, but also Americans and others that are also in the hostage crisis.
You mentioned there the information sourced by the UN. Would you say, from what you just mentioned, that it's not a reliable source?
If you look at the UN, there's very little reliable. Listen, my family's from Syria. I've known family in Aleppo and Damascus that were miles away from chemical attacks. The UN supposedly was looking at information to remove chemical weapons, which never happened in Syria. So I'm sorry if I don't trust them. The World Health Organization, through pandemics, was using the UN for information about what was the source of the virus. That was bad information. So the UN has ended up being a voting bloc for Russia, China, and other dictatorships that then use that as a propaganda arm to flood the waves with information that is just false. So no, I'm not going to necessarily trust the first thing that comes out until Western media like Sky News and CNN and Fox and others actually begin to vet it. I mean, even yesterday, Elon Musk took away the blue check on New York Times because it was using UN information that ended up being false.
So who would you trust then?
I trust verified, vetted information that is corroborated on multiple different venues rather than just one. And the UN has been a echoing chamber for Islamist interests, for petro-Islam, for Iran. I mean, if you look at the negotiations with Iran, those were simply giving them a green light to get billions. We ransomed hostages only on a month or two ago in order to give them $6 billion that then they turn around and shift other monies around to fuel this war. So the match that was lit by this was lit by the appeasement forces of the UN and our own White House, as Biden has basically not done anything to have the Middle East fear America anymore. And that vacuum's been filled by the worst forces on the planet, and Hamas has felt a green light to light the Middle East on fire. So, yeah, I would rather use information that's corroborated by folks like the Wall Street Journal, Fox News, Sky News, and others that I think are more about American interests, Western interests, Australian interests than necessarily Islamist apologetics.
Okay, so in terms of a solution, you've mentioned a few things there, but what do we really need at the end of the day to end this altogether?
At the end of the day, we first have to bring back the hostages that were abducted safely. At the end of the day, the operation needs to happen in which there's a response that decimates Hamas and that they can't do this again. I'm hearing verbiage about two-state solutions and both sides. These are pablum for folks that somehow have moral equivalence. There is no moral equivalency to what Hamas did. This is genocidal. And to see what's happening across universities and in some news agencies that are saying that somehow a terror war that attacks innocent civilians, attacks festivals, and attacks schools and children. And they found documents, by the way, that even the UN, by the way, corroborated and said that these documents said that Hamas's method of operations was to target festivals and schools, and they had lists of where the schools were, where their missiles were going to be launched. That cannot happen again. So the solution is, number one, military, and then number two, after that, then we talk about a humanitarian corridor to make sure that once Hamas is decimated, Palestinians can rebuild their communities and have a new government and a new process to control their future.
We do have to wrap it up there, but Dr. Zuhdi Jasser, thank you very much for your time.
Anytime. Thank you.